Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us again for the Kaplan Education Foundation's series on Black education. This is our fourth presentation in the series. Today's lesson is going to be looking at the question of education as a civil right, resisting the resegregation of public schools. And before I get into the lesson, I want to share that, if you've been following the series, you'll see that we're trying to follow somewhat of a timeline. And in this lesson, we're going to be capturing almost 100 years worth of history. And rather than try to, kind of go through each piece of this history, I decided on a different approach. And so I hope this is beneficial to all of us. It is not possible to fully comprehend the forms and forces of oppression Black people have had to resist and overcome without first appreciating the magnitude of the oppression within the field of education. Among the obstacles and impediments erected in the history of the U.S. against African Americans, the obstacles to educational access and achievement serve as the foundation in the hierarchy of institutional racism. As the gateway to careers which then lead to wealth accumulation and housing, education is the critical cornerstone of the advancement of any people. Remove that platform or put efficient blockades in its path, and you will have effectively shackled that community to the dungeons of generational poverty with little hope of escape. For African Americans, generational poverty and all its snares and entanglements have not occurred haphazardly, but by conscious, deliberate design. The engine for every form of institutional racism one could name: police brutality, mass incarceration, employment or housing discrimination, is oiled by the discriminations Black people have experienced in the fields of educational attainment. So here I have a model just to show the way in which, just to visualize, again, 100 years of history in essence with respect to this question. So as you see there, we have a cycle, and this cycle represents the chain of generational poverty. The levels of discrimination that Black people have experienced, if you watch the lesson prior, that talked about the development of public schools. As we move into the 20th century, the 1900s, we find laws enacted state by state, beginning in the South, but in certain places, even in the North, that put restrictions on Black folks' access to public schools. In certain cases, erecting entirely separate districts where Black students then went to school that were dilapidated, where they had lack of resources and lack of funding. As we know, one needs a decent education in order to get decent employment. And so clearly there's a link there between one's educational development and one's employment opportunity. And certainly one's ability to gain housing is largely determined by one's income, one's wealth accumulation, or at least one's ability to accumulate wealth and how that plays into our credit system. And absent all of those paths or there being effective obstacles, as I shared earlier, in those paths, then one finds oneself vulnerable to being caught up in the criminal justice system. Later on in the presentation, I'll make that link between education and the criminal justice system a little clearer. But what I want folks to truly appreciate is that with respect to the African American experience in the United States, the 20th century was the critical century in which this cycle was formed and developed, in certain cases by the erection of laws, by the passing of legislation, both at the federal level and at the state and county level, that locked Black people out of opportunities that were made available to white folks. And it is that lock that we ought to pay critical attention to, because even in certain areas where that lock, that legislative lock, may have been lifted or unlocked, the legacy of that period in which it was locked remains with us to this day. These laws, this cycle, for most of us in this country has been taken for granted. Yet it is the consequence of a century of legislation that has had a lasting impact. The very development of the middle class, the very image of what we think of when we think of the Midwest, of the suburbs, is the story of how the US government, through various legislative means, lifted out of poverty into generational wealth an entire generation of those who are now understood to be white Americans. This was done with the expressed exclusion of African Americans at every point and measure. Beginning with the Homestead Act of 1862, the Social Security Act of 1935, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, also known as the GI Bill of Rights, and the redlining and racially restrictive housing covenants that followed. These acts taken together enable the development of wealth accumulation and inheritance for an entire generation of families who heretofore were threatened by the mere proposition of competing with newly freed Black workers. So formulaic and embedded in the internal social construct of this country, this cycle has become that one can, with scientific certainty, predict the life outcomes of entire families just by knowing their zip code. This is the structural in structural racism. Equal protection clause be damned. In the United States, the obscenely unequal funding of public schools in state after state across the country, excuse me, is the devilish details of institutional racism. The title of a 2019 Washington Post article reveals the degree of the discrimination that has only increased with each generation. The title of that article states it very plainly. A report finds $23 billion racial funding gap for schools. Overwhelmingly, white school districts receive $23 billion more than the predominantly non-white school districts in school and local funding in 2016, despite serving roughly the same number of children, a new report finds. The funding gap is largely the result of the reliance on property taxes as the primary source of funding for schools. Despite the landmark ruling in 1954 that separate was unequal and unconstitutional, and that states should proceed with all deliberate speed to integrate their school districts, this country has only propelled backward into an entrenched segregation that confounds our efforts at achieving racial justice. In fact, the only integration that has occurred is the cohesion of race and class oppression into a binding lock based in property tax. In 2018, ProPublica produced a database in which one can literally go onto their site and test to see the level of segregation within their own school district. Based on civil rights data released by the US Department of Education, ProPublica has built an interactive database to examine racial disparities in educational opportunities and school discipline. Look up more than 96,000 individual public and charter schools and 17,000 districts to see how they compare with their counterparts. This map, taken from this database study, shows that wherever Black people live, there we find the highest concentrations of educational isolation and structural neglect. Now, for those of you that have participated in our previous lessons, will find something very interesting in this map. It looks very similar and follows the same pattern of the slide that we discussed that shows the composition or the geographic distribution of African Americans in 1850. So clearly, this truth has carried from then till now. Imagine a Black child sitting in a classroom composed entirely of other Black and Latinx children living in a county where white children also live, learning about the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision. Imagine that child looking around his classroom and wondering what happened. Such history becomes mere fantasy when the separate and unequal conditions experienced by her childhood predecessors are the same conditions she experiences every day in her public school. Outdated textbooks, outmoded technology, if any. In many cases, without any structured recreation or arts programs. Imagine music classes without instruments, asbestos-infected walls in rooms that are too cold in the winter and too hot in the spring, with teachers that are underpaid and overwhelmed. It is a sordid and surreal existence that can only lead to a disdain for one's country or a disdain that turns inward against one's self. To tell such a child to ignore these conditions and study hard to achieve academic success is toying with more than that child's feelings. It is to speak from a place of denial and disregard that child can see right through. The anti-Blackness displayed here is palpable in its disdain for Black people, Black youth, and Black children. It is what enables the school to prison pipeline to exist. Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, addresses the rise of mass incarceration as a lasting vestige of slavery and segregation. The over-policing of Black communities has led to the stark increase in police presence in schools where Black children predominate. The lack of equity, the lack of concern has caused the steady flow of Black children from the classroom into the criminal justice system, penalized for doing things that white kids are easily tolerated for doing. Certain cases in recent years, we've seen children as young as 5 and 6 shackled by police officers, crying and calling for their parents. This is no different in spirit and intent than when their ancestors were trafficked from auction blocks to plantations. It will take nothing short of a movement to change the current realities facing Black children in public schools. As valid and necessary as the successes of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, following the Brown v. Board of Education case was in advancing racial equity in US society, the realities of racial inequity yet indicate that there is much work yet to be done. In that movement, the example of little Ruby Bridges stands like a tall tree in a forest of greatness. This year and this month marks the 60th anniversary of her integrating the elementary school in her Louisiana community. Ruby, born the same year as the Brown decision, would enter the school under federal marshal escort. Mobs of white parents and youth hurled spit, rotten tomatoes, and eggs and all manner of profanities in her direction. Ruby Bridges did not, just get included into the school system there. She was among a number of Black students that had to pass a test created by the county under the auspices of determining what Black students had the smarts to integrate with their white children. She passed the test, and yet white community in mass refused to embrace her as their equal in the classroom. As you see here in this slide, it was not about merit. It was about race prejudice. It was about race hatred. The way this story has been told would have us imagine that a 6-year-old girl woke up one morning and decided on her own to walk downtown and enter that school building. Mind you, this school that Ruby would integrate was literally down the block from where her family lived. The segregated school that she had been attending was miles further away. But again, history would have us believe, the way it's been told, that little Ruby did all this by herself. Scant mention is ever made of the woman most responsible for this historic moment, her mother, Lucille Bridges, seen here in this picture, coming out of the school that first day with Ruby. Miss Bridges passed on earlier this summer. In speaking about her mother, Ruby Bridges said, "My parents are the real heroes. They sent me to that public school because they felt it was the right thing to do." Calling her the mother of the civil rights, calling her a mother of the civil rights movement, Ruby further stated, "Today our country lost a hero, brave, progressive, a champion for change. She helped alter the course of so many lives by setting me out on my path as a 6-year-old girl." I want to note that not only did they have to walk through this mob of white families, they received death threats. Her father lost his job. White parents removed their children from the school. That first year, Ruby integrating the school ends up being taught in a classroom by herself. By herself. No white teacher in the school would teach her, except one woman who was not from the area. She was from Boston, Barbara Henry. Such is the trauma that Ruby experienced. The spirit of that trauma is the trauma that all Black children experience in an educational system that remains hostile to their presence. Lucille Bridges, recollecting herself, said, "I wanted it better for my kids than it was for us, so that my kids could go to school and learn." There are Black parents all over this country this day who would say the same for their children. The megastar athlete LeBron James captures this desire and motivation in this video that is more than a mere commercial ad.
Here comes James. He's all alone.
We always hear about an athlete's humble beginnings. How they emerge from poverty or tragedy to beat the odds.
Cleveland fighting for a trip to their first finals.
They're supposed to be the stories of determination that capture the American dream.
All along me, I can hear you crying.
They're supposed to be stories that let you know these people are special.
All around me, I can hear. So what is gonna happen now?
But you know what would be really special?
A year after opening, LeBron James's I'm Bobby School is showing results. 90% of the children show.
If there were no more humble beginnings.
This work, the work of educational justice, is based on a simple premise. The hopes and aspirations for success in the life of a Black child should not be hinged on one's ability to run, sing, or dance, but on their capacity to think, to create, and to reason. Black families navigating poverty have been blamed for the often over-exaggerated and over-sensationalized failures of their children when it is the system itself that has failed them. It is not the sole responsibility of a family to ensure the academic success of their children when the gates of educational attainment are guarded by the sentinels of segregation and policed by the legislative lords of inequality. A child's capacity for greatness is determined by their intellect and will, as guided by the equal opportunities afforded them by the society that claims them. This is the justice in educational justice. Thank you for sharing this time with us. Those of you that are interested in learning further, I invite you to consider these texts: The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America; Savage Inequalities, Children in America's Schools by the great Jonathan Kozol; Eyes on the Prize, that storied collection of the civil rights movement; and Living Apart, How the Government Betrayed a Landmark Civil Rights Law. These texts will help you to better appreciate this 100-year story that I tried to capsule in these few moments with you today. And I thank you for, again, being with us. For those that are interested in learning more about the work of Origin, I encourage you to check out the website, racial-justice.org, and look forward to being with you again in our next lesson.
Hello and welcome to the Kaplan Educational Foundation series on the privilege in higher education. I am delighted to be here with you, especially following the lesson that we just presented. I am here with Eware Sayande, who of course has been the person that we have gone to educate our scholars, but also to educate the entire team about the history of the United States as it relates to education, the lack of access, diversity. But most importantly, what I always walk away, especially after watching a video like that, is that in knowing everything that we know so far, that we have to accept the responsibility that comes with this knowledge, and that we have to act each day in making sure that these injustices do not continue. This is not just about being a passive listener. This is really about being an active educator, being an active citizen in addressing all of this. Of course, I am here also with Rhoda Tabacco, the Director of Operations for the Kaplan Educational Foundation, someone that insists on talking about these topics all the time with me, and who's constantly quoting Eware and saying, but do you remember that slide? Or Nancy, can you reshow? And so,
Guilty.
and because I talk to her every day, I can tell you that the two of us have walked away from this also understanding that there's much more for us to know and to continue to bring out to the audience. So I want to welcome Rhoda Tabacco and Eware, and I am, again, it's truly an honor to be with the two of you today discussing this important subject. And so welcome. Hello, Eware. Hello, Rhoda.
Yes,
Hello.
As a student, thank you.
Good to be here.
Well, Eware, I think you've given us a lot to talk about. I will say, as we bring this conversation closer and closer to present day, I get all the feels, right? And so this is the topic of the time. And so I just want us to dive right in here. And so in this presentation, you show how education is a critical link in a chain of segregation that Black America still faces. So many watching may not be able to fully appreciate that, given the images we see of Black success in America. You shared the commercial of LeBron James. I love this example. So what's your response to this image?
Certainly, I would imagine that folks who are not African American might look on TV and see all the images that they see of Black success and watch episodes like ours or this one in particular and say, hey, what gives? We see Black people, pursuing their dreams at every turn. And what we ought to, and what I want to remind people is that what you're seeing is certainly real. Yes, there are LeBron James and there are Oprah Winfrey's and there are Barack Obamas and the like, and Black achievement occurs just about every field of endeavor one can pursue. In fact, that is the case. Yet, what is not shown, and what is not given its just due, is the fact that when we see, say, again, these famous African Americans achieving greatness, what we're not seeing is the masses of Black folks who are kept down, weighted down, literally chained down into structures of generational poverty. Why I love that commercial in particular is because LeBron lifts this fact up. He ends the commercial by saying how much better it will be when we don't have to come from humble beginnings, meaning that everybody starts out equally, that everybody has an equal shot. And in the case of those young boys and girls that don't have the capacities and God-given talents of a LeBron James or a Serena Williams, or, have the voice of, my generation, it would be, Sade or Aretha Franklin, or maybe that's a little further for some folks, certainly a Beyonce for this generation, that they can still be assured of opportunity. That's the world that we're looking for. And to be alive in a generation of African-American achievement where some of the most, spectacular of us in terms of this society are recognizing the same, and that we need to do great work and are using their resources to see that playing field made a bit more even than what it is. What I'll end here with is that at the same time, I think it's a statement, a damning statement on a society that proclaims itself to be a democracy, yet equality is dependent upon the efforts of individuals and the corporate sector. That should not be the case in a society that claims liberty and justice for all. And so the work of democracy has to become this. This is the African American experience.
Yes.
It's at every generation looking after its own interest. In looking after its own interest, literally works to expand our understanding of democracy for all people. And so that's what we see occurring. And that's exactly what the situation that we're seeing right now is really about. History has shown itself that whatever benefits the Black community en masse benefits all communities in this country.
Yes, I hear that, and as you were saying that, and in looking, and LeBron basically challenging this narrative that you must come from humble beginnings, and we're getting into. I just always feel like there is an unbalanced romance with the concept of humble beginnings. It's almost they are only appreciated within the context of great wealth, right? So I feel like if someone is like, I am here, I am wealthy, and there is this sometimes questionable narrative of just how humble somebody was. But for the people who are in poverty, it's almost an embarrassment, a shame. It's shameful, right? To be poor. But it's great to be poor in your past if you're rich.
That's right.
And so, and we're in COVID right now where we can see the problem with that, right? And so there are people who are, rather than us saying, hey, how can we support people to remain safely at home, investing so children can learn and in safe environments, it's like, now you got to risk it all because you happen to be poor. And that is your lot in life. Yeah. And so I think that brings us to our next question. So what are some ways that these concerns of inequity are showing up during this pandemic, specifically for Black children and how that affects their education? And what are some of the patterns? Because it seems like the danger in being okay with seeing people in a certain way when it comes to life or death. How is this looking for people?
I would say that with respect to what's occurring right now, some of the patterns that I'm witnessing that are disturbing to me is, of course, the continuation of this criminalization of Black youth. There have been reports of students being suspended from home because they happen to have a toy gun in the room. They happen to, appear to be playing with a toy gun. And
In their
as a
own house.
consequence of in their own bedroom, and as a consequence of that, teachers are flagging them, suspending, and they are being suspended. That level of discipline is anti-Black, it is racist, and it again doubles down on this narrative that I mentioned, and only have time to mention in the presentation itself regarding the school to prison pipeline. I don't know the particulars, right? We're only getting these snapshots in the media as they're coming forward, but then I would have to imagine that a student that experiences something like this, I guess, could become eligible for a type of discipline that does indeed place them in that pipeline. So going back to the other question, this is the link. In the presentation, I talk about that link from education or the discrimination that folk experience, the Black people particularly experience as a consequence of discrimination in education, such as that example. There's another example that is becoming a pattern. Of course, just, the Zoom bombing, I guess it's called, where there was, in addition to the racist Zoom bombing that's been occurring since COVID, where mobs of white folks show up into a random Zoom call, one that they are not invited into for sure, and began to throw up images that are either white supremacist or clannish, depictions of Black people being lynched, have occurred in certain cases, burning crosses, etc., profanity, epithets, you name it. Recently, I read a report where a school district, I believe it's in Florida, I'm not certain of that, Florida or Texas, where an entire school, families in this predominantly Black school district, or school district that had a disproportionate number of Black students, families were receiving, students' emails were being spammed with racist, sexist, and pornographic imagery. The kind of trauma, this is what I'm trying to get to, the kind of trauma that Black students have to face in this period is unlike any other community who, yes, we're all going through COVID, right? We're all dealing with that extra burden and the trauma of worrying and being constantly anxious about whether or not we're going to get sick. Yet, if you look at what is being carried forth as in terms of reportage around this reality in families with respect to schools, as we know, schools are struggling with, do we open? Do we stay open? Do we work from home? How do we do this? In New York, families, there's a racial divide. African-American families are opting to keep their kids at home, whereas white families in the main are pretty much okay with sending their kids to school. And of course, this has everything to do with the fact that African Americans, along with Latinx communities, are disproportionately being impacted in a grave manner with respect to COVID. And that goes back to what? All the other structural elements of oppression that Black people experience. So yes, there is a tremendous burden that African American families and Black students are being confronted with in this period. And this is going to, bring us into the next question in terms of how I intend to respond, likely. But, when we talk about what needs to happen, we tend to end our sessions, our Q&A between us on talking about, okay, what needs to happen? We need to encourage, look for, and support parents the same way Ruby Bridges' mother made certain critical decisions that put her family at risk. For her, she recognized we're already at risk. You see, this is the reality Black families are facing right now. We are already at risk. And so it is at the moment of crisis, when crisis is at its peak, that you experience people make decisions. They are willing not just to experience the risk, they are now willing to take the risk. And it is my hope that we begin to witness African-American families and others decide to take some risk that really put this on the front burner of our society's consciousness. We should not be lulled into a sense of greater security in light of the coming administration. The reality that Black people have experienced has been present regardless of who happens to be in office. Now, certainly I'm of that choir that is quite thankful to know that the present occupant of the White House is on his way out, whether he wants to accept that fact or not. Yet we have to be vigilant in pursuing the best interest of our community and not hanging our hopes on the next leader to get it right.
Definitely. You hit so many notes in that. I'm going to try to catch up. So first, we did get confirmation that did happen in Florida, Seminole County, for anyone who's looking to follow up on that. And geez, you always give me so much to think about. Well, shout out to Ruby Bridges and her mom, clearly. I have always looked up to her as somebody who for the first 14 years of my life was the only Black student in her class, her grade, until I went to boarding school. My parents, again, similar, invested all of their resources in our education. Sure. And I think I can fully understand what you're talking about as far as the stress and trauma. I think trauma, we're gonna unpack that one of these days. The trauma that it takes, intergenerational trauma and how that shows up. Yeah. Right? Why are some families, it's just automatic you're going to college, and in others that is a luxury that our family does not partake in. And then I start to think about I am able to work from home, right? We're able to work from home safely. That's because either ourselves or a generation above us encouraged us to invest in our educations. So that provides us a level of security and safety that others don't have. But for those that may not necessarily understand trauma, or they're just not there yet, I think it comes down to dollars and cents. And I think that for those who may be skeptical on the other pieces, I think you've eloquently laid out exactly how the money, for those in power, have made decisions to not put money in certain places. So where people sometimes like to talk about an achievement gap, I like to discuss a resources gap. So before, while we still have some time left, I would love to talk about this figure, $23 billion.
It's amazing.
That's a chunk of change. So what do you think it's going to take to get this equity, to get, I don't think we're going to get $23 billion out of somewhere, but that to me is indicative of showing where people invest in what they want to grow.
Yeah.
It will not grow without invest. So I would love to get your thoughts on that.
Most education activists would quickly say that all activism around education, public education in this country, begins at the school board. So we have to really promote and advocate for families to get involved at the school board level. Bring your concerns to the school board. I'm imagining that everything is online now. And so if there are families that are watching this, if it's resonating in terms of you recognize that, yes, my kid isn't getting an equal education, but I didn't realize how wide the gap was. I'm fired up. I want to see something done. I would say it begins there, but it certainly doesn't end there. From there, you go to the state legislature. Somehow the conversation has to move from the school board to the state legislature, where the decisions are being made. Most public schools in this country, as that report indicates, are funded as a consequence of property tax. So that's where the division ends up being a class division. But of course, we know in the US, you cannot separate race and class. Yeah. Race informs how class is lived in our society. And this is the lesson to appreciate that, right? Where we talk about how the various codes were enacted, the leasing codes that determine, people wrote in the lease, you do not sell this home. You can sell this home to anybody, but you do not sell this home to African Americans, or the opposite of that. You sell this home only to white persons or people at the time called Caucasian. That type of activity that was local, state level, and federal created the map of America that we live in today. So the activism begins in your local county, it moves to the state level, and the fight really is there. You know, the fight really at the end of the day, it's there. You can have, you know, the person who operates in DC as the education czar or whatever title they're giving them these days. They're really just a figurehead to all of this. State is where the action really occurs and where we really got to push the button, because even I'm in Philadelphia, and this has been a conversation that's carried on for generations, whereas you can have a predominantly, you know, say Democrat liberal city like Philadelphia, you can have a predominantly Democrat liberal city in Pittsburgh, possibly Harrisburg is the same way. Yet across the state, Republicans predominate, county after county. So at the state level, you're dealing with a state legislature that, if not is controlled by Republicans, certainly overwhelmingly informed. Legislation that comes out of the state is informed by Republican interests. And the Republican Party has historically shown a lack of interest in assuring educational equity in our education system. So, you know, for me, you know, to make a longer answer, somewhat shorter, the activism begins at the school board level, and it with intention to bring it to the state. We have to make demands on the state, regardless of who is in control of the governorship, regardless of who is in control of the state legislature. And the question has to be, or the fundamental demand has to be, we need to stop determining how schools get paid based on property tax. We need to set school systems for success and equity. That means that each school district gets the same amount of funding. That's the spirit of Brown versus Board of Education. Anything less than that is only a continuation of the segregation that was occurring prior to the decision made in Brown versus Board of Education.
I think that, thank you for that. And I'm going to kick it to Nancy for the end, but I just wanted to say this piece. I really appreciate that answer, because I know I work with, as you all know, I work with community college students, and there was a lot to unpack with this current election season. And one of the things I always went back to with my students is, regardless of your political leaning and regardless of your frustration, you need to be involved in what happens in your local government, because that's what touches you, how money is spent. So I think encouraging everybody to get involved, but also what you invest in grows. Right now, people are what we're trying to save. So to your point, let's value people over things. Yeah. And so I will kick it over to you, Ms. Sanchez. You're rocking with us.
It takes me a time to really process everything that you're both discussing. You know, as a woman of color, and as somebody in education, in leading the Kaplan Educational Foundation, I'm always conscious, especially when Aware gives thoughts on what to do, right? And what are the things that we need to do. What I also want to make sure that it is understood that everybody should have an interest in creating greater access, and that staying silent is not an option. And I say that because oftentimes we say, well, what can I do? Let me just tell you what you should not do, right? Like, do not be silent. If you see that there is a lack of diversity, if you see that there is a lack of investment in education, if you see that whoever you voted for, whoever is not interested in education, both from the federal, it's not interested in at the local, that we all should call each other on this and say, wait a minute, this is important. Because regardless of where you stand in the political spectrum, your children will be educated with other children who, even in a very wealthy neighborhood, are likely to be in the proximity and be friends with other people. And so let's make sure that we all accept that silence is not an option. I know that time goes by so quickly. I was looking at the time because I didn't want it to go by. But I do understand, we had that presentation. We only one lesson away. Is that correct? From our final
Yep.
2 more lessons.
Yep, tomorrow.
2 more lessons, and it's going to carry us through this year. But we really do hope that this is Kaplan Educational Foundation is sponsoring this, and we wanted to put this together because we want this to live for a long time in the conscious and in the internet. And we want to make sure that you share it as much as possible, that if you think that this is something your students, you as an educator, can really benefit from, or encourage a conversation, as you have seen with Rhoda and Iware, that this is exactly where it begins. This may be the first action that any one of us can take to educate ourselves. And so I cannot leave this session without thanking Iware Sayande. I much respect to you and your work, to your initiatives, to the fact that you're really putting all of your efforts and making sure that we have information like this, that we know that there is an action, that to know that we all have to be engaged in this. I never leave any of these sessions without really taking that in, but also wanting to make sure that I put that out. Of course, Rhoda, thank you so much, because you process this information in a way that I know is internal. I know it is family, it's everything, but you also put on that hat of educator and leader in this profession. And you have encouraged this series, you have supported this series, and I am grateful for that we're able to put it together. To Dan Strafford, our producer, thank you for making sure that we're only working to making this better. Really appreciate you. To anyone that provides support to the Kaplan Educational Foundation, or anyone that is interested in learning more, please, I want to make sure that I remind you to go to kaplanedfoundation.org. And I want to give that an opportunity to Iware. I know that it was in the presentation, but Iware, if you can also provide your information, that would be great. And Rhoda, if there's anything that I'm missing, please, and then we'll close it out.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you so much. This partnership between Origin and Kaplan Educational Foundation, I think, is a critical intervention during this period. I know that when you reached out to me and said, "Hey, let's see what we can do to provide a way for folk to better understand and appreciate, why they're seeing people in the streets, why folks are crying Black Lives Matter at this time." There's a long trajectory that we really need to appreciate to understand that. And so and I think it was ingenious on the part of Kaplan Educational Foundation as an educational institution to say, here's the intervention that we can provide. And so I'm very grateful to share in this partnership with you toward that end. Right quick, though, I do want to say this for any of our white friends who are watching and who are questioning, so what can I do? What can I do as a white person, as a person who's wrestling with all this stuff on race and my place in it? Take a page from the story of Barbara Henry, a white woman from Boston who finds herself teaching in that school district where little Ruby Bridges was going to school, had just been integrated, and no white teacher in the school was willing to educate her. Now, I don't even know what Miss Henry's background was in education, what her expertise was, but whatever it was, she had the expertise in caring for others. And if there's anything that we need right now, it's that. People who have the capacity to see in others what they see and desire for themselves, and be willing to extend themselves in that way to assure that everybody has the opportunity. Imagine her sitting in that classroom
Alone
with little Ruby by herself for an entire year. That's the kind of commitment that we're looking for. That's the kind of commitment that our times call for and require. And because of persons like Miss Henry, we have examples, right? So we don't have to start from scratch. We have examples. We have people that we can look to. We have lights in the darkness. Let us there's a quote by I think it's by President John Kennedy, where he said, "I didn't come here to curse the darkness, but to light a candle. We need more candles."
Yes. My goodness.
And this is the
I am.
season of lighting candles. Am I right?
That's right.
Let's do it.
Yes. I think that's the word to end on. I don't think we left anything out.
Yeah, we can't add anything to this right now. Thank you, Laura. I'm always humble in learning about our people. Always. Thank you for being that partner for us. Thank you.
See y'all next week.
Yes.
See you next week.
See you next week. Bye, everyone.